3 years ago, a man was offered more money than most farmers see in a lifetime. The offer was real. The buyers were serious. The paperwork was ready. All he had to do was sign. His neighbors thought he was crazy when he said no. Some called it the biggest mistake of his life. Others said he was too stubborn to know a good deal when he saw one. After all, who turns down a fortune for a piece of farmland? At first, it looked like they were right, but then something happened. The wells started dropping. The ponds began shrinking. The rivers slowed to a trickle. And suddenly, the most valuable thing in the region wasn't money. It was water. By the end of this story, the same people who laughed at him would be desperately wishing they had made the same choice. Because what this farmer understood about his land would change everything. And when the water shortage finally arrived, it turned a decision everyone mocked into one of the smartest moves anyone had ever seen. In farming, timing can mean the difference between success and failure. Plant too early, and frost destroys your crop. Plant too late, and drought steals your harvest. Buy livestock at the wrong moment, and years of profit disappear. But sometimes, the most important decisions happen long before anyone realizes they matter. This is the story of one farmer who saw something others didn't, and when the crisis came, it changed the future of an entire community. The land sat in a dry agricultural region where farming families had worked for generations. The soil wasn't famous. The scenery wasn't spectacular. And from a distance, there wasn't much that seemed special about it. At least that's what most people thought. The farmer had inherited the property from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather before him. For decades, the land produced crops and supported livestock through good years and bad. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Then developers arrived. At first, they came quietly, a few surveys, a few meetings, a few rumors spreading through coffee shops and local feed stores. Then the offers started. One by one, farmers began selling. Some received enough money to retire comfortably. Others used the payout to move elsewhere and start over. The numbers being offered were difficult to ignore. Life-changing money. Money that could eliminate debt. Money that could buy new farms. Money that could secure an entire family's future. And eventually, the developers reached this farmer. The offer was enormous, far larger than anyone expected. Friends told him he'd be crazy to reject it. His family urged him to think carefully. Even people who respected him assumed he would accept. Why wouldn't he? The land wasn't producing extraordinary profits. Agriculture was becoming more difficult every year. Costs kept rising. Weather kept becoming less predictable. Selling seemed like the obvious choice. But the farmer kept asking questions. Questions nobody else seemed interested in asking. Questions about underground water. Questions about old springs. Questions about historical drought records. Questions about aquifers. And the more answers he found, the less interested he became in selling. Nobody understood why. Not yet. What he discovered beneath the property would soon become more valuable than all the money he had been offered. And within 2 years, the entire region would find out why. Long before satellite maps and weather forecasts existed, early settlers chose farmland using a simple rule. Follow the water. Water determined where families settled. Water determined which farms survived. Water determined who prospered and who struggled. Most people had forgotten that lesson. Modern agriculture relied on pumps, reservoirs, and infrastructure. Water seemed endless, reliable, permanent. But the farmer wasn't convinced. Years earlier, his grandfather had told him stories about a natural spring hidden on the property. Most people dismissed those stories as old folklore, yet the farmer remembered them, and when he began studying the land more closely, he noticed something unusual. Even during dry periods, certain sections of the farm remained greener than surrounding properties. Small depressions retained moisture. Trees stayed healthier. Pastures recovered faster. The signs were subtle, easy to miss, but they were there. Curious, he brought in experts. The findings surprised everyone. Beneath the property lay access to a substantial underground water source, connected to an aquifer system that appeared more resilient than many nearby supplies. Suddenly, the land looked very different, not because of what was growing on it, but because of what was hidden beneath it. Still, almost nobody cared, because at that moment, water wasn't a problem. The reservoirs looked fine. The wells were working. The region had experienced dry years before. Life continued as normal. The developers increased their offer. The farmer said no again. The laughter grew louder. People called him foolish, stubborn, greedy. They believed he was throwing away an opportunity that would never come back. And for a while, it looked like they were right. Then the weather changed, and everything changed with it. At first, nobody called it a crisis. Farmers are used to dry spells. A few weeks without rain isn't unusual. Even a month can be manageable. So when the first signs appeared, most people weren't worried. The rainy season arrived late. Then it arrived weaker than expected. Fields that normally soaked up moisture remained dusty. Ponds filled only halfway. Small creeks that usually flowed through the countryside slowed noticeably. But many believed the weather would correct itself. It always had before. Or at least that's what everyone hoped. Weeks turned into months. The clouds came less often, the temperatures climbed higher, and every day the landscape seemed to lose a little more life. Pastures stopped growing. Livestock producers began feeding stored hay much earlier than normal. Crop farmers watched their fields anxiously. The uncertainty was spreading. Still, few people were truly alarmed. Not yet, because drought is unlike a flood, it doesn't arrive overnight. It creeps in slowly, quietly, almost politely, until one day you realize everything has changed, and by then, it's often too late. The first major warning sign didn't come from the sky, it came from underground. And when farmers started checking their wells, panic began to spread. One morning, a local farmer noticed something unusual. His pump was struggling. The pressure wasn't what it used to be. At first, he blamed the equipment. Maybe a clogged pipe, maybe a mechanical issue. But after inspecting everything, he discovered the real problem. The water level had dropped significantly. A few days later, another farmer reported the same thing. Then another, and another. Across the region, wells that had reliably supplied water for decades were beginning to fail. Some produced less water. Others stopped altogether. Suddenly, the conversation changed. People weren't talking about rainfall anymore. They were talking about survival. Without water, crops couldn't grow. Without water, livestock couldn't drink. Without water, farms couldn't function. What had seemed like a temporary inconvenience was becoming a full-scale emergency. The local reservoirs shrank. Farm ponds turned into muddy depressions. Water restrictions began appearing. Every week brought worse news, and with each passing month, the value of water increased. The farmer who had refused the offer watched all of this unfold carefully. Unlike many others, he wasn't surprised. Concerned, absolutely. But surprised, not at all. Because years earlier, He had already started preparing for this exact possibility. While others expanded production, he invested in water storage. While others ignored old springs, he studied them. While others assumed the supply would always be there, he treated every drop as precious. At the time, many people thought he was being overly cautious. Now those same decisions were beginning to look very different. For years, preparation had looked like paranoia. Now it looked like foresight, and the gap between those two things was about to become painfully clear. As conditions worsened, something unusual began happening on the farmer's property. Fields nearby turned brown. Pastures across the region struggled. Livestock producers reduced herd sizes to conserve resources. Yet sections of his farm remained productive. Not perfect, not untouched, but noticeably better than surrounding land. Neighbors started paying attention. Then they started asking questions. How was his pasture still holding up? Why were his animals in better condition? How was he managing when everyone else was struggling? The answer led back to something many had ignored for years. The water beneath the farm. The underground source wasn't infinite. No water supply is. But it was proving far more reliable than the systems many others depended on. Combined with years of conservation practices, efficient management, and careful planning, it gave him options when others had none. And in agriculture, options are everything. Because when drought arrives, flexibility becomes survival. Every gallon saved matters. Every decision matters. Every resource matters. The farmer wasn't thriving because he had discovered magic. He was succeeding because he had respected a risk most people refused to take seriously. A risk that was now reshaping the entire region. Then came the moment nobody expected. The same developers who once wanted his land returned. Only this time, the conversation was completely different, and what they offered next shocked everyone. When the developers first approached the farmer years earlier, they saw acreage, potential construction sites, future expansion, investment opportunities. That was before the drought, before the reservoirs shrank, before wells across the region began failing, before water became the most valuable resource in the county. Now they saw something entirely different. They saw security. They saw access. They saw one of the few properties still positioned to withstand a worsening crisis. And that changed the value of the land overnight. Word began spreading. Agricultural consultants were talking about it. Local officials were talking about it. Farmers were talking about it. The property that many had dismissed as ordinary was suddenly attracting attention from people who understood exactly what was happening. The developers came back, and this time the offer was even larger, much larger. The kind of number that makes people stop what they're doing. The kind of number that changes generations. The kind of number that causes even the most determined person to think twice. When neighbors heard about it, many assumed this would finally be the moment he sold. After all, he had already been proven right. Why not take the money and walk away? Why not cash out at the peak? Why not secure a future without uncertainty? Those questions seemed logical, but the farmer saw something others still didn't. Because the drought wasn't over. In fact, signs suggested it might be getting worse, and if water shortages continued, the true value of his land had not yet been fully realized. The offer was enormous. The pressure was enormous. But once again, he said no. And that decision stunned almost everyone. Because now he wasn't just rejecting a fortune, he was rejecting an even bigger fortune. The criticism returned. Only this time it sounded different. People no longer called him foolish. Now they called him obsessed. Some said he was gambling. Others said success had made him overconfident. But deep down, many were beginning to wonder if he simply understood something they didn't. Months later, the drought reached a level nobody had imagined, and suddenly, the entire region was forced to confront a reality it had ignored for decades. The second year was worse, far worse. The reservoirs dropped again. Emergency restrictions tightened. Feed prices exploded. Water transportation costs soared. Some livestock producers faced heartbreaking decisions. Animals require water every single day. There are no shortcuts, no delays, no negotiations. Without reliable access, impossible choices begin appearing. Across the region, herd sizes shrank, production declined, stress levels rose. Families who had farmed for generations were struggling to hold on. Every week brought another difficult story. Another farm reducing operations. Another well running dry. Another producer facing uncertainty. And throughout it all, one lesson became impossible to ignore. Water wasn't just another farming input. Water was the foundation beneath everything else. Without it, the machinery didn't matter. The buildings didn't matter. The equipment didn't matter. Even the land itself lost value. For decades, many people had focused on what was above the ground. The crops, the livestock, the infrastructure. Now everyone was focused on what lay beneath it. And suddenly, the farmer's decision years earlier looked less like stubbornness and more like vision. But what happened next is what transformed him from a local curiosity into a local legend. Because when many people would have taken advantage of the situation, he chose a different path. As conditions worsened, neighboring farms faced increasing pressure. Some desperately needed access to water. Others needed temporary relief to keep livestock alive. The farmer could have focused only on protecting his own operation. Many people would have understood if he did. Instead, he began helping where he could. Not recklessly, not carelessly, but strategically, sharing knowledge, offering advice, helping neighboring producers improve water efficiency, working with others to stretch limited resources further. The goal wasn't simply to survive alone. The goal was to help the community survive together. And that changed how people viewed him. Years earlier, he had been the man everyone laughed at. Now he was becoming the person everyone wanted to learn from. Not because he had predicted the future perfectly, but because he had prepared for possibilities others dismissed. The difference was enormous. Preparation doesn't guarantee success, but it gives you options when problems arrive. And during a crisis, options can mean everything. Then, just when it seemed the story had reached its conclusion, experts studying the region made a discovery that explained why the farmer's instincts had been so accurate all along. And it would completely change how local farmers thought about land forever. By the third year of the drought, researchers, water specialists, and agricultural experts were studying the region more closely than ever before. They weren't just trying to understand what had gone wrong. They were trying to understand why some farms were surviving better than others. Patterns began to emerge. The differences weren't random. Certain properties consistently performed better during dry conditions. Certain areas retained moisture longer. Certain water sources proved far more resilient than expected. And once the data was analyzed, a surprising conclusion appeared. The farms that had endured best weren't necessarily the biggest. They weren't necessarily the richest. And they certainly weren't always the most modern. They were the farms whose owners had understood water. The farms where water management had been treated as a long-term priority rather than an afterthought. The farmer's land became a perfect example. Years before the crisis, While others focused primarily on expansion, he focused on resilience. While others planned for normal years, he planned for difficult years. While others saw land, he saw a water system. And that difference changed everything. Experts later explained that many communities across the world had spent decades valuing farmland based on production alone: acres, yields, market prices, equipment, infrastructure. But the drought exposed a hidden truth. The future value of farmland would increasingly depend on access to reliable water. Not someday, not eventually, now. Suddenly, people weren't asking, "How much land do you own?" They were asking, "How secure is your water?" And that shift would permanently change how many farmers viewed their operations. But despite everything that had happened, the biggest lesson wasn't about water, it wasn't about money, and it wasn't even about farming. It was about something much deeper, something that affects every decision we make. Looking back, many people asked the same question. How did so many intelligent people misjudge the situation? How did an entire community overlook something so important? The answer lies in a simple human tendency. Most people judge decisions based on immediate results, not long-term outcomes. When the farmer rejected the first offer, everyone focused on what he was giving up: the money, the security, the opportunity. Very few people focused on what he was protecting: the future. Because the future is difficult to value. You can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't measure it easily. Yet the future is often where the greatest opportunities live. The farmer wasn't rewarded because he was lucky. He wasn't rewarded because he had a crystal ball. He was rewarded because he understood risk differently. He spent time thinking about possibilities most people ignored. He asked questions others didn't ask, and he prepared for outcomes others considered unlikely. That mindset doesn't guarantee success, but it dramatically improves your chances when uncertainty arrives. And farming is built on uncertainty. Weather changes, markets change, technology changes, conditions change. The people who survive longest are often the people who prepare before everyone else realizes preparation is necessary. The irony is almost impossible to ignore. Years earlier, people laughed because they believed he was sacrificing his future. In reality, he was protecting it. Today, the story is told differently. Nobody talks about the offer anymore. Nobody talks about the paperwork. Nobody talks about the developers. What people remember is the decision. The choice to think long-term when everyone else was focused on the short-term. The choice to value resilience over immediate reward. The choice to trust what he knew even when nobody agreed with him. Because when the water shortage arrived, it revealed something that had always been true. The most valuable assets are often the ones people overlook, until they're needed. For years, the farmer's land appeared ordinary. Then the drought exposed its true worth. For years, his caution looked excessive. Then the crisis revealed its value. For years, his neighbors believed he had made a mistake. Then, reality changed the conversation. And that's the lesson at the heart of this story. Sometimes the smartest decisions look foolish in the beginning. Sometimes preparation looks like paranoia. Sometimes patience looks like weakness. And sometimes the opportunity everyone is chasing isn't nearly as valuable as the thing they're leaving behind. The farmer never knew exactly when the drought would come. He never knew how severe it would become. But he understood one simple truth. When everyone is focused on today's rewards, the greatest advantage often belongs to the person preparing for tomorrow's problems. And when tomorrow finally arrived, The laughter stopped. Stories like this remind us that farming isn't just about crops, cattle, or land. It's about decisions. The decisions nobody notices at the time. The decisions that seem insignificant. The decisions that often look wrong until years later. So here's a question for you. If someone offered you a fortune for your farm today, would you take the money? Or would you keep the land? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy real farming stories about resilience, strategy, and the decisions that changed lives, make sure to subscribe, because the next story might completely change how you think about farming.